Our speaker tonight, I count as an American hero. You know, a lot of times we have guest speakers and they'll talk about this event, this battle, whatnot, and all the great generals. But, you know, to me the real heroes are the average citizens that go off to war, because you couldn't have the great generals if you didn't have the average Joe Dogface out there doing the fighting. And this man is part of the greatest generation that Tom Brokaw called the greatest generation. He was a farm boy and went off to war with, you know, no thoughts, no protest, at an age when they didn't protest wars. And finds himself in Europe and caught in one of the greatest debacles of the latter part of World War II, rivaled only by the fall of Corregidor and Bataan in the Philippines at the beginning of the war. This, of course, is the Battle of the Bulge, when, as we're making progress against Europe, American troops were overrun in a massive counteroffensive by the Wehrmacht, the German army. His tale, I have heard it numerous times. I never get tired of hearing it. I'd heard about him all my life because his sister, his nieces, were my neighbors. One of them's here tonight. And always heard about Uncle Bill. And I didn't get to meet him until adulthood, and I think the first time I heard this story was down at Antrim Battlefield. We came to have him speak down there. But tonight, it's an honor and a privilege to have him here at Allison Antrim. And let's make welcome our own Bill Diehl.
Kid, I'm no hero. It's been 60 years since I was a prisoner, so I'll try to tell you what it was like being a prisoner of war from December 44 to May 45. I was a rifleman in Company I, 423rd Infantry, 106th Division. They told us that we was the brightest and the youngest division ever to go overseas, the best trained. The reason we were the wise or the smartest, at that time the Army had the Air Force, and Americans pretty much controlled the skies. These fellows had 1 or 2 years of college, and they transferred them from the Air Force into the infantry. So that made us one of the smartest divisions to go overseas. Whenever we qualified for the M1 rifle, I shot expert. I had the second highest score in the company, and I was beaten out of first place by an Indian from Florida. His name was Ben Gunn. When we, on the 12th, we arrived in Belgium. They hauled us up to the front in trucks, all except the last 10, 12 miles. That we had to walk, carrying a full pack. We just got new Arctics, and they decided we would be warm enough carrying all of our equipment that we should put our overcoats in our duffel bag, that they would get them to us later. And many a time I thought about that overcoat in that duffel bag because it got so cold. We didn't have it. Now, my first day on the front, I was an aide to Captain Moe. He was our company commander. Wherever Captain Moe went, I went. He spent the first night in a concrete bunker on the Siegfried line. I stood guard at the entrance to the bunker from 12 o'clock midnight to 2 o'clock in the morning. Now, we had a heavy snow, and the evergreen trees, the boughs was weighted down with this snow. And the wind, I stood with a grenade because it was so foggy and dreary, I could throw a grenade as far as I could see. But I'd hear this snow falling on the ground, sound like someone walking. I don't know how often I pulled the pin out of that grenade, but I pulled her out pretty often. So it was a German plane that either crashed or was shot down, and it caught fire. And you had that old sweet smell, I guess a burnt body. His boot landed up on a tree, and the wind would blow, you'd see that old German boot just going back and forth, back and forth. I tell you, I was glad when my 2 hours was up. The next morning, Sergeant Wood took me out to my squad on the front line. Now, we had a front of 25 mile, and I believe my squad was the first people on the end of the 25 mile. They were going to drop everything but parachute. They gave us a list what collared chutes had what. It might have been yellow for ammunition and red for food. I don't remember now, but I knew back then. It was so foggy the planes couldn't fly. We didn't have anything to eat. On the 16th of December, the Germans started their attack. Well, before that, one night before that, Sergeant Wood was checking on his men, and we just had a skiff of snow, about like a half an inch, and he seen these footprints in the snow. Now, we all had Arctics on, and this fellow looked like his shoes might have just been half soled. They were put on with hobnails, wooden pegs, and he thought, what in the world? So he followed those, he followed the tracks, and he ran into the fella. And he got to talking to him, and he asked him if he was ever stationed in Texas. No, he never was in Texas. He asked him who Babe Ruth was. Well, he knew who Babe Ruth was. He asked him if he was ever at Camp Fannin. Yes, he was at Camp Fannin, but only for a short time. Well, he pulled his weapon on him because Camp Fannin's in Texas. And he searched him, and he found he had a pair of wire cutters in him. Now, our telephones never would work. As soon as they would get them fixed, somebody or something broke the wire, and we couldn't use the telephones. So he took him back. They took him back, and they interrogated him. The next morning, when the sergeant came around to check on us, he told us he interrogated the fella at SS Colonel Squarzini, had 500 English-speaking Americans in American uniforms, and they were there to change road signs, do anything they could to mess us up. And they did. They'd give you orders, and we'd follow some of their orders. It was the 16th of December. At daylight, the Germans started their offensive, and they knew exactly where we were. And they started fire. They fired for effect because they knew they was right where we were. Shells would hit the trees, and there would be wood and shrapnel flying, and you'd get hit, and you'd feel for blood. If you didn't feel blood, well, then you was hit by wood, but you felt pretty good. And of course, we had men hit, and we had 2 men that was right in our area, and we thought they were the luckiest men going, that they got hit. They would soon be back to a hospital and getting a hot soup and hot coffee, and anybody would have traded places with them, because I'm going to tell you, anyone that says they're not scared when they're in battle, I don't believe them. I'm telling you, it was really bad. It was something. We held off for 3 days. On the 19th of December, the sergeant came around and got my squad, and he said Captain Moe wanted to talk to us. Well, I thought we were going to go someplace else because we really hadn't had a whole lot of action where we were. So we goes, and there was our whole company sitting there. And just as soon as we got there, Captain Moe got up on a stump. He said he had just received word from Colonel Cavender and Colonel Klink that the Germans had been in touch with them, that we were completely surrounded. Surrender in 2 hours or be annihilated. Colonel Cavender said he couldn't see his boys sacrificed, that we would surrender. Well, sir, everybody was to take off their left Arctic and slit their left Arctic with their bayonets so the Germans couldn't wear them. If anybody had any ammunition, bury it in the snow. Take your rifle apart, throw the parts away, bend the barrel around the tree. When that was done, we got our equipment destroyed. The Germans were there. They lined us up in a column of twos, and the first thing they done is they searched us. If you had a ring with a stone in it, they would try to get that off, but our hands were swollen. They couldn't get anybody's ring. They took everybody's identification bracelet. Why he wanted them, I don't know. All they had on was your name and your serial number, but he took everyone. Then he would get in your wallet, and he'd take all the pictures out of your wallet, and you'd tear them up in little pieces and throw them up in the air, and they'd come down on the snow. 6 days before Christmas, a lot of our men had just got married before they went overseas. And when they tore those pictures up, the men couldn't take that. They cried. And some of them was really sad. It was a sad time. When he came to me, he took my watch, an identification bracelet. Now, before I went into the Army, I went up to say goodbye to my Uncle George and Aunt Esther up in Mercersburg. And when I was leaving, they had a gift for me. It was a King James Version of the Holy Bible. Aunt Esther, she read a lot, but she told me in the Civil War she read where a Bible stopped a bullet. And she told me, Billy, if you ever go to the front, take the Bible with you. I promised her I would, but boy, I almost didn't, because we had so much stuff to carry, but I stuck it in my pocket. I wanted to be as good as my word. So there is my Bible. He took the Bible and he looked at it. I don't know whether he could read English or not, but he handed it back to me. He looked me in the eye and he nodded his head. And I would say now, that was one of the wisest things I ever done, is to have the Bible with me. It's the only thing we ever had to read. I was taught the 23rd Psalm as a child. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. We got a lot of comfort and a lot of courage out of reading that Bible. I never knew an atheist in prison camp. After we were searched, we started a walk. And we walked a short time and we hit a logging trail. And we walked that logging trail and it made a sharp turn to the right. And there off to the left was two of our ambulances. Every door was hanging open. One door was really screeching. There, the drivers, they were slumped over the steering wheel. The boys on the litter in the back was the two boys that we thought how lucky they were. They had shot in the head too. Their bodies was frozen stiff. They were all on their bare feet. They had all been killed for their socks, shoes, and their boots. It was sad. We walked a little more till we came to a clearing. That's where we spent the night, in that clearing. The guards built themselves a fire. We broke off branches off of the evergreen trees that lay on top of the snow so we could lay down. I don't think anyone slept that night. We just could figure, we never gave it a thought we would ever be captured. Killed maybe, wounded yes, but never would we surrender. But there we were, and it was getting cold. We laid on the branches, and we laid like hogs, one on top of the other around so we could use the body heat to try to stay warm. The next morning, at daylight, they started to walk us. And we walked a little ways, but not about 2-3 hours, I would say. We started to enter Germany. And we walked through the villages. The women and children would run out with their arms full of rocks, and they stoned us. And that really pleased the guards. We walked till we came to a railroad. And there was a whole railroad full of boxcars, empty boxcars that the Germans used to bring their equipment up to start the offensive. They put 60 men in a car that was designed for 40 men or 8 horses. The car I was put in, I think, was the worst car on the train. It had a lot of boards off of it, and it had hauled horses up to the front, and we had about a foot of frozen horse manure in the bottom of our car. Well, we got in there, we was really cramped. The first thing we done, we used the corner of the boxcar, that was a latrine. That night it got so cold, and it stayed cold. And now I didn't know at the time how cold it was. But I've read in a book now, it was 35 below zero. It was the coldest winter they said ever in Germany. It was so cold. We all laid facing the same way so that you could put your hands under the armpits of the fellow in front of you or between your legs, his legs, to keep your hands from freezing. Our feet was already numb. We had no feeling in our feet at all. But your ears and your hands, oh, they were so cold. In fact, it was so cold, we had to help one another to urinate. Your hands were so cold, you couldn't feel the tab on the zipper. You had to get someone that could see that tab, and then he would work it up and down for you, and that we helped one another. That's what we, and it was so cold. Now another bad thing happened. We had no water, and we was thirsty. And then stopped that train, and we could hear the railroaders or the guards walking by the train. And the men that still had watches, they'd hold them out the car and try to give a watch for a glass of water, get a drink. No one would ever give us any water. We never got any water in that car. We were in there 6 days, and we never got any water or food. On the 24th of December, that morning was different. That was the first time we saw the sun since we was in Belgium. And it was good to see something yellow, just to see something bright, but awful cold, awful cold. About 2 o'clock in the afternoon, we were in the railroad yard. Of the town of Limburg. The air raid siren went off. We could hear some of the men, how they got out of their cars, I don't know. We couldn't get the door open on our cars. Well, sir, they dropped the bombs. Our car would rock, and it seemed like it would get off the track about 2 feet and slam it back down. Your body was so cold, it stung your whole body. And we didn't have anybody hurt in our car, but our car was surely hit. And after the air raid was over, one man got up and stood against that door that we couldn't get open. And that door moved that easily, he almost fell out of the car. Evidently, some frozen ground or something hit the lever on our car and knocked the dog out of the eye bolt. We got off of the car and we was sucking on dirty snow. Oh, we wanted water so bad. We sucked on dirty snow, and then you'd spit the cinders out. Tried to get a drink. Well, they passed word up from car to car. And they got up to our car. They said there was a direct hit on the last 2 cars of the train, that 60 of our officers were killed. Well, some of us got together and we got to talk, and I thought maybe if there was 60 killed, there surely had to be some wounded, some injured, that maybe we could go back and help them. But the guards seen us getting together. They made us get back in the car. So we were penned in the car again. The next day was Christmas Day. Cold, oh, it was so cold, we was all laying the same way with our hands under the armpits of the fellow in front of us. About 11 o'clock, the door of our car opened. Here was 2 German soldiers, each carrying a Red Cross parcel. They threw the Red Cross parcel into the car, so the men, they started divided. what you got in the Red Cross parcel, you got a can of corned beef, a box of cheese, a few crackers, you got instant coffee, you got a can of powdered milk, a box of oatmeal, and a box of raisins, and they filled up all the spaces in you had sugar cubes, almond sugar cubes, and they filled up the spaces with cigarettes, 4 cigarettes to a box. Well, the fellow that cut the Red Cross package, he divided it. So my Christmas dinner was about a tablespoonful of dry oatmeal dumped in horse manure stained hands. That was my Christmas dinner. The day after Christmas, they took us off of the train. Now we could see how much damage that the British done when they bombed the railroad tracks. Those cars definitely wouldn't have been moved for quite a while. So we started to walk. We had to walk. Well, we walked quite a ways, and we came to a stream. And we all ran to the stream to drink water. It's the first water we had. And we drank, and we drank. I drank so much that I actually swooshed whenever I walked. Funny thing, but after you drink, automatically you're hungry. Then you get the hunger pangs. Well, sir, we kept walking. Now a bad thing happened. I guess the dirty water gave us a dysentery. And I really don't want to talk about it. We helped one another. You used ice, you used snow, you used bark, and it weakened you so. There was accidents. I just don't want to talk about that part, but it was weak. Oh my, we were so weak and tired and cold. So we spent that night in a woods, and we went back together. The boughs off the evergreen trees to lay on top of the snow again. We found a dead horse back there. The horse was frozen. Some of the men had knives, and they cut meat out of the horse, and we roasted that meat on a fire, so we had something to eat. That was the first meat we had. The next morning, we started to walk again. It's the only time that I was ahead of the column. The only time. So we walked all morning. All we saw was snow, trees, and rocks. And I judged it was close noontime. We was almost to the top of the mountain. And there was a clearing. And we looked back in that clearing. It was the prettiest little blue and white cottage you ever saw, with a big stone fireplace on the end, smoke coming out the chimney. It was really pretty. I heard a door slam. And I looked up, and here came a girl about our age. She came right down to me. She says, "You guys are American." I said, "Yes." She said, "So am I." I said, "Well, where are you from?" She said, "I'm from Chicago." I said, "What are you doing over here?" She said, "I came over to visit my grandparents and can't get back home." Well, the guard came running up, chased her in the house. She could outrun the guard. She'd run a little ways, and she'd turn around and she'd wave. The guard would take off after her. She'd run a little further. She'd get ahead of him. She'd turn around and she'd wave. The guard, he'd take off after her again. The next time, she ran right up to the house, but she turned around and she was waving with both arms to her. And I often wondered if she ever got back to Chicago. And that girl doesn't know what it really meant to us. We hadn't heard a girl's voice for 2 months. Just to hear a girl's voice, it really meant a lot. And we thought maybe someday we could have a pretty girl like that in a cottage. And it really done a lot for our morale. It kind of gave us second wind. And we started. And I don't know if she ever got back, because she would have been in the ration zone whenever they divided the territory. The next day, we walked again, same old thing. The only field that I seen that ever was drifted Now, we had nothing to eat, but that field had sugar beets in it. And that's the only field that we seen was drifted, and we'd run over and kick a sugar beet, break it off. They were frozen solid. We'd hold them under our arm and we'd gnaw on them, try to get something to eat. You'd hold it as long as you could and gnaw, and then you'd give it to somebody else and they'd gnaw on it a while. He'd take it, if he couldn't hold it anymore, he'd pass it on to somebody else. And that's what we had to eat. I believe it might have been the last day of December. We were up in the mountain, and here we came to a clearing, and there was a little stable right along the road. I guess we'd call it a farmette. Now, the house was way back. The guards, they went down to spend the night with the farmer in the house. Well, my best buddy was Jim Bard. He was from Edwardsville, New York. We beat it up in the haymow. And there's only room in that haymow for about 8 people to lay down. Well, man, and they had 2 cows, and those men, they laid all over them cows, and the cow gives off a lot of heat. Man, they was really comfortable. They had a nice place with them cows. But we had it pretty good up in that barn, too. The other fellows, they went across the road, and they built a fire. 2 guys came in, and they were going to sleep in the feeding entry. You know, they dug down, and good golly, Ned, they found the farmer's potatoes. That's where he had his potatoes buried so they wouldn't freeze. So they passed the word out that there was potatoes in the feeding entry. Well, man, we got potatoes, took them out and threw them in the fire and let them get real black and pull one of them babies out and roll around in the snow that you could handle it, break it open, steam flew out of that potato. I tell you, that was the best potato I ever ate in my life. And it was so good, we ate all the peeling and that black stuff. We ate that too, because it tasted pretty good. And you know, I don't know what, but something slowed our dysentery. Whether it was that black stuff on that potato or what, I don't know. But it really slowed it up. The next night, we walked all day. We started early in the morning, and it was dark. We arrived at Stalag 4B near Muhlenberg. Before we went in the gate, everybody had to take off their helmet, throw their helmet on a pile. You walked a little further, you took your helmet liner, and you threw it on another pile. Then we went in the gate. As soon as we got in the gate, they gave you a bowl, a tablespoon, and a cup. They had 4 butchering kettles. 2 of them was full of hot soup, and 2 was full, they called it coffee. The coffee was made out of acorns, and it was bitter. I never cared for it. The only thing, it was hot. That part was good. The soup was delicious. Well, boy, I ate my soup, and I watched everyone else was through the line, and they might have had a couple of gallons of soup left in the 1 kettle. And I got another half a bowl of soup. I ate that. Then they took us to another big building. High ceiling like this baby here. We had to undress. They took us in there. We didn't know why we were in there. All of a sudden, water came down from the ceiling. Hot water. Oh, man, did that feel good. We were so cold, we got a shower. After we got a shower, we got dressed. They took us to another building. It goes in the other building, they wrote your name in the book, your name, rank, and serial number. Then they painted a red triangle on the front of each leg and on the middle of your back. That was how they distinguished their prisoners of war. They gave you a dog tag. My dog tag, 312598. Then you got that, they gave you 1 letter you could mail. They said that would probably be the only mail you was ever allowed to mail. You'd never be able to receive any mail. So what you wanted to say to your ones, you got 1 chance, and they was going to give that to the Red Cross. After we got done with the building, they put about 15 or 20 of us in a barracks with British soldiers. They were captured in North Africa, so they've been prisoners quite a while. And they said the last 6 months has been awful. They used to get a Red Cross parcel every week, and it wasn't too bad. But the building, you had no heat. There was no heat in the building. There was a pit. They had to leave the water run all the time or it would freeze. So you used that pit, that was your latrine, and that's where the excess water went. And the rations came around every morning in the honey wagon and pumped everything out. And then the rations done all the work in the camp. And then they came around every day with the dead wagon and would gather up the dead. But they was mostly rations and pulleys that they would gather up. One night, well, we had no mattresses on our bunks. We just had boards. And we would sleep at night, 3 of us, in the one bunk to try to use a little body heat to keep warm. One night it was so cold, and we had a stove, but nothing to burn. So some of us, I know in my bunk, I left one board in from my feet, one from my rear end, one from my shoulders, and one from the head. The rest of the boards I donated to the stove to warm up. And a lot of the other fellows done the same thing. So we survived that night, but man, it was an awful cold night. One night, there was a British soldier. He came in. And he said he was convinced that the other British soldiers was convinced that there was no German spies among us. He said there was a radio in camp and he wanted to give us the news. He said the Americans had reclaimed all the ground that they lost in the battle. He said they called the battle of the Bulge. He said the Americans had 80,000 casualties and the Germans 100,000 casualties. Well, we were surprised to hear that many casualties. We were surely sorry to hear it. In my outfit, in fact, in the 3 days that we was in battle, I wrote down how many. We had 416 dead, 1,246 wounded, and 7,001 missing. But most of those were prisoners of war. But sometime we were there, well, what we got to eat, in the morning you got a piece of bread, brown bread, that you always had to divide with someone. I always divided my bread with Jim Bard. He would cut it one day, I'd cut it the next. That's the way it worked. We had generally Rudy Baker soup. That's what we'd get a bowl of Rudy Baker soup in the evening and another piece of bread. But you'd get coffee at both meals, at their acorn stuff. It wasn't hardly coffee. One morning they came in early and they called out 10 names in our barracks. Jim Bard and my name was on the list. He said, get your things and fall outside and wait there. So there was 10 of us. We got our things. All I had to get was my Bible, and we went outside. Next barracks, wasn't long, 10 men came out of there. The next barracks, 10 men came out of there. As soon as they got out, we started to walk. And we walked into Muhlenberg, and we got on a train, passenger train. It was so warm and nice and clean. Now they had partitions in their trains, where our trains has the aisle going down through the center of the car. Their aisle was along the side of the car, and they had these partitions in there. It would be about 12 men to each one, and there was probably 4 or 5 of these on a car. Well, we were riding along, and man, we was warming up. We really enjoyed the trip. Beautiful scenery. I had to go to the bathroom, and I had to go to the bathroom pretty bad. And I asked anyone in my section if they knew what you said to the German when you had to go to the bathroom. No one knew. Well, the fellow at the end said he'd go over and see if the other boys knew. So he went over there. Dan Blackwelder and Russell Capman, they could speak German. Dan Blackwelder said he would go and see the guards, see if we couldn't go to the bathroom. He came back. Anyone that has to go to the bathroom fall out in the aisle. Well, I probably had to go to most, but boy, I'm telling you, there was a lot of them got in front of me. I got back of this tall, thin fella. And he was so tall, he had his look over to look out the window. and he'd straighten up. Wasn't long, he'd look out again. He'd say, boy, he says, this country reminds me of the Cumberland Valley. I said, Cumberland Valley? I said, well, where are you from? He said, I'm from Hagerstown, Maryland. I said, well, I'm Bill Diehl, I'm from Greencastle. Oh, he said, is that right? Yeah. Went a little further, and he says, Diehl. He said, I guess you wouldn't know a Shorty Diehl that played basketball for the Fairchild Cardinalettes. I said, yeah, that's my sister. I said, do you work at Fairchild? Yeah. Went a little further. He said, I guess you wouldn't know a Jacob Beamerstaffer. I said, yeah, I know Jacob Beamerstaffer. I knew his father, I knew his mother, I knew his brother Ira. Virginia graduated with me in my graduating class. I said, how do you know Jacob? He said, I'm a helper on the machine he ran at Fairchild. So Ed and I became very good friends. Good friends. We rode that train all that day. It was dark when we got off at night. We got off the town of Freiburg. We walked from Freiburg to Brand-Urversdorf. And we walked by Brand-Urversdorf. There was a bunch of buildings. And there was a sign. It says Paul Rock. What it really meant was sawmill and box factory. They made ammunition boxes and grenade boxes. The sawmill was up in the mountains, and they shipped the logs all in on railroad cars, but they had two wood-splitting machines there. The Germans had converted their trucks and their cars to burn wood. They had boilers in them, running them with steam. If I knew gas was ever going to get this high, I'd have paid more attention to how those things were done. But I don't remember, but I know they ran steam. Well, sir, we walked down, and here we was living what was one time the chicken house. And my golly, Ned, there was a stovepipe stuck out the window, and there was smoke coming out. We had heat. That's the first time we had any heat at all. Well, this was better already. We walked in, there was a 50-gallon drum. They was burning sawdust. If any of you want to know how to build a stove that burns sawdust, see me. That old barrel probably saved our lives. The next morning, we had a mean guard. We only had him for 1 week. He hit Ed Slayman in the neck twice in 1 week with his rifle barrel, with his rifle stock. And Ed don't know to this day what in the world he ever done. But he was only there 1 week. The next morning, we got the same thing for breakfast. We got bread and we got coffee. They took the small boys, put them in the box factory to make boxes. Us heavier guys, they took us up on top of the hill, and we had two machines. Instead of standing there with a wedge and a hammer, instead of having a wedge and a hammer, why they had these machines that come around, and you would just stick the log in there, and the wedge would split the logs the whole way. And I ran one of the machines. So then they ran it through the chipper, and it broke pieces of wood up to about the size of your fist. And that's what they was burning in their cars. Now we had a new guard that came, and his name was Rudolph Hockner. And Rudolph was a pretty good guard. We had one man, Arthur Taylor. He was from Ohio. Arthur couldn't speak German any better than I could, but he was interested in coins. Anybody that came in that place, he would bum them for coins, and it was amazing how many coins he would get from people. He would just bum them, and they would give him the coins. Now, Paul Rock was the owner of the place. He was a Nazi. Paul Faust, he was a superintendent, and he looked. If any of you remember, Alf Harnish. Did anybody here remember Alf Harnish? He looked exactly like Al Harnish.
Big nose.
Yes, sir, he had it. Yes, he had it. And that's what he looked like, Al Harnish. And then we had another fellow named Alex Penner. Alex wasn't a Nazi. He was a professional glass blower in his time. He was retired. And there's two things I always remembered about Alex. He had not a hair on his head by having the kiln and being around the heat. He had no eyebrows. He never had to shave. He had no hair. And there's another thing he would do, and he liked to do this. He could sneeze with his mouth shut, and his cheeks would just blow out like a balloon. And he liked to do that. And he could roll a cigarette with one hand. He'd flip that tobacco in there, but he was the easiest man to make cry I ever seen in my life. I would get done splitting wood, and then I'd get down and I'd talk to Alex, because he had the stove going. And I'd tell him American soldiers would come, bring cigarettes, bring chocolate, bring coffee. Oh, the tears, he would just start to cry and go on. Germany used to have that. Hitler's niche boot. Oh, he despised Hitler. Then we had another old man. He had a team of Belgian horses. And he would take some of the Russians and some British soldiers, and they would go out and cut some wood locally and bring in. And Ike was 80-some years old. Then we had the girl in the office. Her name was Rita. And the guys in the box factory, they had no eye protection of any kind. They would get sawdust in their eyes. They'd have to go over to get Rita to take the sawdust out of their eyes. Well, Rita, she pretty much liked Dingus Banks. And I think Dingus liked her. So they would watch whenever Paul would go up to the house to eat dinner, he'd go over and eat lunch with the Rita. And they was pretty much in love, I think. I thought maybe there might be a match there, but we left one order so quick, he never even got a chance to tell her goodbye. Now, Arthur Taylor, he was a guy you just had to like, and he liked our guard. Rudolph Hockner and him just got along fine. And you could tell Rudolph really liked him. So one Sunday, he came down. We didn't work on Sunday. He came down and he asked Arthur if he'd like to go up and bring his coins. They'd look at his coins and play the radio, hear some music. Well, boy, we haven't heard any music for, I don't know when. Yep, they'd like to do that. So they got one other man to go up with them. They came back, and boy, they said how good it was to hear music. Really good. But Dan Blackweller, he had an idea, because we hadn't heard any news. He said, see if you can't get him to invite you up next Sunday. And he said, we'll just raise thunder down here. We'll just act like we're fighting something awful. And you know what he'll do? He'll get his rifle and he'll come running down. Whenever he runs down here, you switch the radio to BBC and on the hour and see if you can't get us some news. Well, sir, boy, yep, he invited him up. I think it was close 2 o'clock. We just started raising thunder, yelling and fighting and going on something awful. And here he came. He came running down with his rifle, and we just kept the fighting. We figured they got the news, well, then we would quit, and we did. He said he couldn't understand it, that we got along fine through the week, but boy, on a Sunday, we just raised thunder all the time. He was going to see if he couldn't work 7 days. They came down with the news, the Americans had just crossed the Rhine. That was the news that we got. Well, we tried to tell them the next day, the Americans crossed the Rhine. No. The happiest I seen any of them over there was the day Roosevelt died. They really came around and made sure every one of us knew that Roosevelt died. They didn't know who the vice president was, and we didn't either. It was a long time that we found out that Truman was the vice president. Another time, it was on a Sunday morning, and I'd say it was one of the coldest days of the year. We was really glad we didn't have to work. Now, BMWs made motorcycles. You could hear those things for miles. They really made a lot of noise. Someone made the remark, Boy, anybody that had to ride a motorcycle on a day like today, he had to be out of humor because it was cold. We listened to that thing coming and coming. My golly, and all of a sudden the throttle left off, and we looked out the window, and there was an SS colonel. He went in, the Rudolph had a room in the house facing the chicken house. He went in there, I guess, to warm up. He was down there about a half an hour. Then, finally, they came out of the house, he and our guard, Rudolph. The old colonel had a clipboard under his arm. He came in our logger. He looked around. He went down over this clipboard. He called out, Bolts, Catman, Blackwelder, Diehl, open that door, Rouse. He said, boy, out we went. No coat on, just shirt and pants and cold. Oh, it was so cold. I started to do the side straddle hop, trying to keep warm. He paraded in front of us, just practically screaming, yelling. He finally left. And I asked Blackwelder, I said, what in the world, what did he say? I couldn't understand what he said. He didn't think much of Germans coming over to kill Germans, that we should have been on Germany's side. So we may as well just stand out there. We're no good to Germany. We may as well stand out there till we got pneumonia. Well, boy, he got on his motorcycle and he left. And I was a side straddle hopping, trying to keep warm. All four of us were. It was really warm. We heard another motorcycle come. And it was coming from the same way that the old colonel came from. He came closer. He went by, he looked in, and he seen us. He went down the road a little bit. We heard him cut off on the throttle. He turned around, he came up, got off his motorcycle. He started to walk towards us. He pointed to Russell Catman. And Russell goes over to him. And they got to talking. And the next thing I know, he was patting Russell on the shoulder. And boy, he went up to see our guard, Rudolph, told us to go over to the box factory and get kindling to put on top of the sawdust so we could really get warm. Well, sir, we were standing there around that old barrel warming up, and I said, Russell, what in the world did you say to that fella? Well, Russell said it was this. He said, whenever I was captured, they couldn't get my Masonic ring off of my finger. And he was walking over towards us. He saw my ring. He was also a Mason. But Hitler outlawed every club except the Nazi Party. But he says, beware, forget-me-nots, a little pin. And he said, we're still in business, but that's what we wear. Well, sir, he told Russell he was sorry for the way the colonel treated us. The colonel was wrong. He said, the war's not going good at all for the fatherland. He said, I would say in a couple months, you boys will be on your way back home. He wished us the best luck. Another time, I was splitting wood. Now, we didn't have any overcoats for a long time. And it was ice and snow frozen on these logs. You could hardly handle them. One morning we went up to the shanty, and there was a whole pile of used overcoats and new hand shoes, new gloves. Man, I got a nice black heavy overcoat. The only thing was wrong with it only had one button on it. Looks like the other buttons was all tore off of it. And we often wondered where they got so many used overcoats. But we found out after they had heard about the Holocaust, we knew where our overcoats came from then. But we split a lot of wood. Then one night I was splitting wood, and something caught on my glove. And I looked, and here the log was punky on the one end, and the Russians, I guess out in the mountain, they drove a steel wedge in that punky part. And I happened to see that. And I split the log so that the wedge stayed in the log. I told Ira Clark, he always fed the machine. And I said, Ira, sometime I'll nod my head. When I nod my head, I'm going to hand you that piece with the steel wedge in it. And he said, stand back, because I don't want you to have the wedges fly out and hit you. I said, don't say anything to anyone. No, he wouldn't say anything. It was only a day or two. There was 4 boxcars came in that night to be loaded with wood. We started, Paul Faust, it's the first time he ever got up to work. Never did. But we had 4 cars in that night, and they knew they were rushed. He got up to help to feed the machine. Well, boy, I thought that's the guy to give the wedge to. So I worked myself down till I got a hold of the wedge. I handed it to him, and I kind of hung on to it, and he looked back, was talking mean. He throwed that thing in there. That whole building trembled. You couldn't see. All the dust on those rafters fell down. We had to wait till the dust cleared to see what in the world happened. We knew the electric motor was running, but boy, the old chipper, it surely wasn't running. Well, Paul was as white as a ghost, and our clerk was just in on him something awful, he said. He ran that machine ever since we've been there. He never had 1 minute's trouble. The very minute you get up and help, you mess the thing up. Well, of course, Paul asked me if I knew anything about it. Oh, I didn't know anything about it. That's why you didn't know anything about it, did you? No, he didn't. Well, that wound that thing up. They tore the rest of the day working on that thing, tearing it down. The next morning when we went to work, there was Paul Rock and Paul Faust, each carrying 2 big bags of wood chips, put them in the back seat of the Mercedes. They had the boiler in the trunk already fired up, and they took off down the road, hunting parts. We never seen them again. I don't know what might have happened, but I do know when Dresden was bombed, I was probably 35, 40 kilometers from Dresden. The fires, they bombed Dresden day and night. I could have read a newspaper 35 kilometers away. 100,000 people killed that night in Dresden. Dresden had never been bombed before. And a lot of the wealthy Germans had moved to Dresden because it had never been bombed. And they thought they was safe. And in fact, Rudolph was gone for a couple days. And when he came back, of course, we wondered where he was. He lost 7 of his family whenever Dresden was bombed and burnt. He had no one left. He was the only one that was left. Kid, my time up?
Well, I forgot to this is part 1. We're bringing him back, so there's plenty more to tell. But
yeah, a lot more to tell.
Yeah, so we'll have. Can we take some questions, please?
Oh yeah, sure.
Let's have some questions at this point. But he's coming back for part 2.
Yes.
Did you ever go back to Germany after the war?
Yes, I did. My daughter is in the Army, and she was stationed in Germany. So Annalie and I went over. I think we was there for 3 weeks, and we started over in Belgium. And whenever I was in Belgium, all you could see was fog. You couldn't see anything. And Belgium's a beautiful country when you see it on clear. Right? We went over, and we went into a hotel, and they had the local historian ran a bar outside of town, and they told us to go to see him. And there was a soldier there, and he told them where to take us. And I knew I had to be almost to the same place I was in the war, because there was a monument there for one of our soldiers that done a good job, and there was a monument there, and we went all around. We went to Diehl, saw some of, yeah, we went to Germany. Mm-hmm.
Well, on cable TV, they are rerunning this show from the early 60s, Combat, with Vic Murrah and Rick Jason. Have you ever seen that?
No, I never had that.
I was trying to get your opinion on that. How about Saving Private Ryan? Did you see that?
Oh, yeah, I see that.
Did you think
that
that
old
was,
tank just sounded exactly right. Yeah.
so you thought that was pretty authentic?
Yep. Now, one other thing I forgot to mention. We got paid We got paid a mark a day. At the end of every month, Rudolph would go to the Hartsmansdorf Bank and deposit our money in the Hartsmansdorf Bank. And he would come back and he'd have our passbook. He'd show us the passbook where he deposited so much money in our account. And I just wondered how much it's worth today. And we could buy two things we could buy. We could buy matches and imitation pepper. If you get down to Phillips and buy a package of cantaloupe seed, that's what the pepper was in, just a little envelope like that. But we didn't have anything to put pepper on. But we could buy it. But one time he came back, he had some those little sweet tablets, white, saccharin. Yeah, he had a couple bottles of saccharin. And boy, that helped that old acorn stuff. That done wonders for that. I can drink that when we had that. Any other questions?
Bill, you said Paul Faust. That's not the Paul Faust.
It's spelt exactly the same way. Yes, sir. Exactly the same way. Paul never tried to learn any English. Now, I was always tired. Oh, one other thing I'll tell you before I forget it. Jim Bard, something happened to his feet and his legs, and they just would swell up. Every time he'd get a chance, he'd take his shoes off and he'd rub his feet. Well, I had to have my feet off, shoes off at the same time. And Jim was struggling to put his on. I said, Jim, try my shoes on. I got big feet. Boy, he put my shoes on, and he said, man, he said, they really feel good. Well, I said, you wear them, I'll wear yours, because I didn't have any feeling in my feet. And I struggled, and I put the shoes on, and I didn't walk from here to the wall. The uppers broke loose from the soles. And there I was, flopping around, something awful. So I worked the inside. Once I got up outside and got on the inside, I was all right that day. I don't know if it was Paul Faust that seen me. I don't know. But the next morning, on the table of my machine, there was a pair of wooden soled shoes. I could wrap a red shop rag around my feet and put them in them shoes. There was only two things wrong with those shoes. When the road was bare, I sounded like a horse. You could never sneak up on anybody, just like a horse. And another thing that was wrong, when you walked in a wet snow, every step you took, you got taller. You'd have to stop and knock the snow off the bottom of the thing so you could keep on it going. And that was, and then another time, we got one Red Cross parcel. And of course it had cigarettes in. Well, now I hadn't had a bath since New Year's Day, and this I believe was in February, and we wanted a bath. So we told Rudolph if he would bring us a tub and 2 buckets, some soap and a towel, we'd give him, each would give him 2 cigarettes. So there was 6 of us. That would give him 12 American cigarettes. Well, they was as good as German money, the cigarettes. In fact, maybe a little better. And by golly, he brought it in one Sunday. Here he came. Well, we drew numbers, see who took the first bath. And my luck ran good. I got number 5. 5 out of 6. So whenever my time came to get in the water was just lukewarm. There was a scum on top of it. The towel was wet. But it was good to have a bath. But we ran the whole time. You never got to take a bath. Your hair was long. They never gave us anything. In fact, they didn't give us anything to eat with. It wouldn't have been for those British having those Klim cans that they saved. I don't know what we would have done to eat our soup with because we didn't have anything. The Germans said that was your problem. Yeah, that was your problem, and I understand. find there's a lot that way today. If you had somebody in jail, it's up to the family to feed him, take care of him. They don't bother much with him. That's what they claim. I don't know. Anything else?
Kind of recap a little. I was captured the 19th of December in the Battle of the Bulge. I was a rifleman. When we were captured, one of the reasons why we were captured, we went up to the front. We were given 16 shells. They was going to fly everything into us and drop it the parachute, and nothing worked out. The Germans attacked us, and I tell you, you can't stop a tank with a bayonet. So our officers said we should surrender. So we did. The Germans lined us up, and the first thing they done was search us. And one of the things that they'd done, they would take the pictures out of your wallet and tear them up in little pieces, throw them up in the air. A lot of our men just got married before they went overseas, and they couldn't take that. When they broke up pictures of their wives, their father and mother, and they cried. It was a very sad time. The next day, that night, we spent in the field, snow, it was so cold. We cut pine boughs and laid on top of the pine boughs, and we laid like hogs, one on top of one another to try to keep warm. We had no overcoats. The next day they put us in boxcars, 60 men to a boxcar. We was in those boxcars for 6 days, 6 days without water. We went 6 days without water, 7 days without a bite to eat. Then Christmas Eve, we was sitting in the depot at Limburg. Now the weather had cleared and the planes could fly. The British bombed us. There was one direct hit on the last 2 cars of the train, and they said 60 of our officers were killed. And there was quite a few men that was killed in that bombing attack. Now, we could never ride that train anymore because they had to fix the tracks. It was an awful mess. So they took us out and we started to walk. And we walked 7 days. And it was so cold. Temperature 25, 30 below zero. And it's like I say, we just laid like hogs. Nothing to eat. And anyway, that's what I'm up to till now. I had to go to work. I was in Stalag 4B a short time. And then he sent us out to work camp. And I worked in a woodworking camp. The German had converted a lot of their cars and trucks to burn wood. They had little boilers in the trunk, and he would put the fuel in the back seat, and then that left 2 people could ride in the car and go wherever they wanted to. So I ran a wood splitting machine. And one day I was splitting wood, I found a wedge, steel wedge in a log. Old Paul Faust was the superintendent of the place. He never got up to feed the chipper or anything, but this day he got up to feed the chipper. We normally got 2 boxcars to fill a day. This day we had 4. So he got up to load the boxcars to help to feed it. Well, I handed him this piece of wood that had the wedge in, and he threw it in the chipper and he blew it up. That was it. The next morning, he and Paul Rock, the owner of the business, they had their Mercedes fired up, and they took off to find parts. Well, in the meantime, we had all the wood split, and we had no place to put anything, so we really didn't have a whole lot to do. Now, it's the 7th of May, 1945. We had breakfast. I can tell you what I had for breakfast. The reason I can tell you why I had for breakfast, I had the same thing to eat from the last week of January to the 7th of May. For breakfast, we had a piece of black bread, which you had to divide with someone. Jim Bard, my best friend, he and I always divided the bread. I would cut it one day, Jim would cut it the next. We never had an argument, but you ought to hear some of those men fighting over a few crumbs. They were that hungry that they wanted all that they could get. Then we had a cup of acorn coffee. That's what we had. bread and acorn coffee. That was breakfast. We never had lunch. Never had lunch. In the evening meal, we got a bowl of rutabaga soup. Now, sometimes it would have a few grains of barley in it, and sometimes a piece of potato, but always rutabaga soup, never any seconds, and then we had our bread, and we had the acorn coffee. That was it. We was wondering what we were going to do, because we didn't really have anything to do, and here came our guard, Rudolph Hoffner. He was our main guard. He came down, said, "Get your things, you're moving out." Well, I thought we was going someplace else to work. Well, we didn't. The only thing I had to get was my Bible. We slept on boards. And I always kept my Bible on the board, which I used for my bed. If anyone wanted to read it, they'd know right where it was at. And a lot of people didn't read my Bible. Arthur Taylor, he collected coins. He would bother anyone came around to collect coins. So he got his coins, and we had two guys trying to make American flags. Well, they got their rags and put them in their pocket, and we took off. We went up on the road, and we turned left. Never been down that road. So we walked, I would say, about 30 minutes. And we were up high, and you look down in the valley, and there, going south from north, was a whole column of evacuees. We goes down to them, and they'd say, "The Ruskies are coming, the Ruskies are coming." Did we know where the Amis were? That was Americans. They all wanted to get to the Americans because they knew the Americans would treat them better than the Russians. Well, we didn't know where the Amis were. They was pulling, some of the men was pushing wheelbars. Some of them was pulling wagons. There's one farmer had 2 horses hitched up to a wagon, all the furniture on the wagon, and had a cow tied on the back, all trying to get to the Americans. Well, they finally passed. They finally got by. Now here came another column. Had one of them big old German cars in front of the column. Then there was Australian prisoners of war. Then there was New Zealand prisoners of war. Then there was a half-track. After the half-track, there was Canadian prisoners of war. Then there was a tank. And we were told to fall in back of the tank, which we did. I would say we walked 2 hours. Now there was a high bank on the left side of the road. And whenever we got in that area, 5 Russian fighter planes flew over. And due to that high bank, they was by us before they could see. They saw the tank and the half-track, and I guess they thought we were the enemy, I don't know. Anyway, they swung around to go left. They stopped the tank so the guards could crawl into the tank so they wouldn't get hit. When I seen the guards running to get under the tank, I took off. I had a field to run down. If I got by that field, then there was the Ore Mountains. And the trees were starting to bud and coming out. I'd be all right if I could get in the mountain. I could hear the planes were strafing and I was running. I got down to the end of that field. I was plumb played out. I just laid down and I was fighting to get wind in my lungs. I finally got straightened out and I stood up. And I looked in the back of me and there was 5 other fellows. They done the same thing. My best friend, Jim Bard, and the oldest man in the outfit, Ed Boats. He was 37. And then there was Nick Bosco, Ralph Gallo, and Bill Peters. Well, boy, we decided we was going to stay together. We'll try to stay together so if anything happened, someone could tell our parents what happened. Well, we started up in the mountain. And good golly, the mountain was full of people. There was a lot of German deserters. There was some of the people that had the finest clothes on, a suitcase in each hand, all trying to get to the Amis. They wanted to know if we knew where the Amis were. We didn't know. They wanted to buy our little wool knit hat we wore under a helmet liner and our shirt. They thought maybe that would help them somehow to get to the Americans. I don't know. But we didn't have anything for sale. When we got up there, I decided I was going to take a bath. I haven't had a bath since February, and I wanted a bath. Well, the other fellows, Jim Bard and I, we had a bath in February because we got one Red Cross parcel, and it had cigarettes in, and we bribed the guard, there were 6 of us, and he brought a tub and 2 buckets of water and a towel and a cake of soap. So that's how we got our bath. And I was number 5, I was the 6th. I remember that part. And so the other boys, they haven't had a bath since January when we first arrived at Starlog 4B. They were going to take a bath too. So we walked down the mountain, and there was a stream about, I'd say, the size of Little Antietam. And we found the hole. It was come up to about here on me. But man, the water was cold. Oh, it was cold. We got in there. We rubbed. We were soaked, and then you'd rub. Boy, but it just had a cake of soap. We rubbed it. It was getting feeling better. While we were in there, we watched 2 German farmers planting potatoes up in the field. So we stayed in the stream until the farmers left the field. Then after they left the field, we got out, left the wind dry us off, put our old dirty clothes on, then we goes up in the field and digs up the potatoes the farmers planted, took them down the stream and washed them off, and we had raw potatoes. And that's what we ate. That night, we spent in the mountain. We went to sleep, but boy, during the night, it got so cold. Well, there were 6 of us, but we thought, well, we would lay together like hogs again on top of one another, but we didn't get warm. So they decided that the next day that Ralph Gallo and I, we should take off for the nearest town and see if the rations arrived yet. Maybe we could find some food. Well, Ralph and I, we would go do that. But we were so doggone cold, we thought, well, we may as well go now, be warmer walking, and what it will be just standing here shivering. So we went down, and here was the railroad track. Well, we decided, why don't we just walk that railroad track? If we had to get the road, we'd have to walk the whole way up that field we ran down, a lot further, and surely if the town mounted anything, the railroad would go to the town. And the ties, the ground was level with the ties. Well, we decided we was going to walk the railroad. Well, we started. And old Ralph, he was a little smarter than I was, I believe. He said, whoa. He said, I'm going back and mark a place so we know where to go back in the mountain whenever we come back. So he broke a little sapling off of a tree. Didn't take it off, just broke it down so we would know that's where our men was up in there. I would say we walked 2 hours on that railroad track. And all of a sudden we seen a dot in the railroad track, way down there. Well, that dot kept getting bigger, kept getting bigger. And by George, that has to be a person. Yeah, I mean it was. Well, I'd say she probably got about 200 yards from us. She left out the darndest scream you ever heard. Americana, Americana. She came running, throwed her arms around us. She thought we was coming to liberate the town, and they wanted the Americans to come instead of the Russians. Then she seen the red pyramid on our pants. That was a German marking for prisoners of war. You had a red pyramid painted on each leg, front of your legs, and one in the middle of your back. Well, she seen that, then she knew we were prisoners of war. She told us her husband was a prisoner of war in France. Her name was Martha Seiche. S-E-I-C-H-E. She said she had 2 children. She had a 10-year-old son and a 16-year-old daughter. And she wanted to know if we wouldn't stay with her. Well, I said there were 6 of us. We got 4 guys back in the mountain, and we wanted to stay together. Well, she said, we can work that out. She said, my father and mother are farmers and live right across the street. If you can sleep 3 to a bed, we can take care of you. Well, we told her, we haven't been in the bed for over a year, or we have an idea we could stand that. That we could do that. So she started walking right down there. She walked down. And I'd say she had probably walked 2 hours. Till we got down to her, she took us up to her place, and she showed us around where we would stay. Well, that was fine. Well, I said, we'll be back in the morning. She says, that's fine, and I'll have the beds, and everything will be ready for you. I asked, do you have any food? She says, no, I have no food. I can't give you any food. I have none myself. But I'll see my father, the farmer, and maybe tomorrow we can have something for you. I said, that'll be fine. So I asked her where the main street was. And this was in Kulm, Czechoslovakia. That was the town we were in, Kulm. And I asked her where the main street was, and she said it was 4 blocks. It was a gradual grade the whole way up to the top. Well, by golly, then we was going to go up and see the main route through Kulm. And we got about, I'd say, 3.5 blocks, and all of a sudden, I heard an accordion, and I heard a mandolin, and then I heard singing. Well, we beat her up the road, and good golly, then here came the Russian army. Had men and women in the back of the truck singing, drinking vodka. They were having a gay old time, and driving Studebaker trucks. And boy, it was good to see something from home, to see the Studebaker. And we stood there and we watched them go by. A few of them would wave to us. And there was one guy in a truck by himself, and the window was down on the passenger side, on the driver's side, and he motioned for everybody to go around him, So he pulled off in front of us and came down carrying a bottle of vodka. He says, Amerikansky Sadat. We said, da. Well, we shook hands. He took a drink of vodka, handed us the bottle. I took a drink of vodka. It about fixed me. I couldn't handle it. I gave it to Gallo, and the same thing with him. He couldn't handle it. Well, he laughed. He laughed at that. Now, he was a stocky, and the stocky fella, he had ribbons all over his chest, and he had the medals. He jiggled when he walked. He even had a ribbon pinned on his fly. They didn't have the discipline in the Russian army that we had in our army, I'll tell you. Well, sir, he talked a lot in Russian, and we couldn't understand what he was talking about. So I happened to say to him, Ich möchte essen. Ja, he said. He goes up in the truck. Now, the window was down on the passenger side. He grabbed 3 cans. If you'd go to Sunnyway and get a large can of V8 juice, I'd say that was the size of the can. He threw 3 of them down just as fast as he could. No labels on the can. Sunshine on them cans, it hurt our eyes. It hurt our eyes. But now we had 3 cans. Now he came back down the truck carrying a box. And some of you men remember they had plug tobacco, Brown's Mule, spark plug. It was a box about that size. It had smoking tobacco in it and cigarette papers, and he gave us that. Oh man, we were really tickled to death. Now we had food. Boy, we were all right. The war was over. Now we was going to go up back in the mountains and have a banquet. So we thanked him. He went by the old Studebaker. He patted the hood, and he kissed the hood of the truck. He gets in the truck, and away he goes. Well, boy, we were just tickled to death. We had a place to stay. We had food. Like we could ask for anything more. So he goes back down, gets on the railroad, and walks back. We walked, and them darn 2 cans that slip out of your hands. We had an awful time carrying them cans. It don't seem like it, but we did. Well, I thought we ought to be ready to go up in the mountain. Ralph said he didn't think so. Well, I said, I think we walked far enough. Well, he said, we didn't come to the branch. But we finally came to the branch. When we was up in the mountain, well, as soon as we got in the mountain, there was 3 Frenchmen. And those Frenchmen had about 3-4 bottles of wine. Well, we thought if we was going to celebrate the end of the war, we ought to have a little wine. So we showed them our tobacco, And we traded them part of our tobacco and cigarette papers for a bottle of wine. So we walked right up the mountain and ran into the other four fellas. Well, they seen what we had. Boy, we're going to get the wood up. We're going to heat this stuff up, and we're going to get enough of wood up. We're going to have a fire tonight, and we can sleep by the fire. We won't get as cold as we did last night. So that's what we done. We gathered up and had the fire going. We had 2 cans of green beans and 1 can of meat, and I don't know what the meat was. It was so white, but boy, it was good. It was really more than we can eat. Our stomachs had shrunk, and we couldn't eat much. We could eat often, but we couldn't eat much. And the wine, it was sour. I didn't care a thing for the wine. So we got the fire going, and it started to get dark. A couple men came down out of the mountain. He said, "You better out in that fire, the flyers will come." Flyers won't come anymore. War's over. Oh, they couldn't believe that. Then finally, I guess the Russians was staying in a few houses along the road, and they could see the light in those houses. And that's the first they seen that for years. And they really believed this thing that the war was over. So the next morning, we gets up, we goes down to see Martha Sykes. Well, we didn't have to go up the apartment and knock on the door. She was standing out on the street waiting on us. She says, "I just heard there's a commissary in town, and maybe you'll go look, and maybe you'll get us some food, and I'd like to bake you a cake." Well, she said, "I'll take the other 3 fellas over to my parents, and you 3 can get down to the commissary." Good. So it was Ed Bolts, Jim Bard, and I, we went down to the commissary. She told us where it was, and boy, we ran right into it. The hasp was pulled off the door. We goes in, and right off to your left, there was a pit. And that pit was full of eggs in a water glass. There wasn't an egg at the top. They were all good. There was a net there, and there was boxes. Well, we filled them box, all the eggs that Ed Bolts could carry. Now, I got to looking around some bins, and I thought I had flour. So if you go to Sunny Way and you get a brown bag, the bag that I found there was about the same in diameter, but it was twice that high. And I filled that thing with this flour. That's all I could carry in this one. Then I got some beans, and I got some peas, dried peas, and rice is what I got. And I don't remember what Jim got. But anyway, we walked back to the house, and Martha seen what we had. She cried. Oh, it was the most food that she's seen. She was just so tickled. Well, we decided, by golly, we'll go back and get her some more. We had nothing else to do. Now, Eisenhower, they had a tape of Eisenhower, and he talked on the radio every 15 minutes. For all Allied prisoners of war, to stay where you are for 1 week. Let the great Russian army have the highways. Then after 1 week, work your way to the American lines. Well, all right. This was the 8th of May, so the 15th, we'd work our way to the American lines. Everybody would see the 15th of May be at the railroad station. We're going to take over the first train that's there. All right. We went down the second time to the commissary, and we ran into Tom Yuki. Tom was one of the 30. And Tom wanted to know if we knew where anyone was at. I said, yes, there's 6 of us. We're staying at Martha Sykes. And I told him that it's Peters, and Gallo, and Bosco, and Ed Bolts, and Jim and I. Well, he says, you don't know, do you? Well, I said, we don't know what? Well, he said, in that strafing, Tom, Charles Hill, and Tom Belleye, they were killed in the strafing. And our Clark, he was hit with 350 caliber shells, but he knew Ed Slayman stayed with him. I've never had anything knock me like that in all my life. I knew that they were strafing, but I never gave it a thought they would be killed. And it just worked on me. after going 6 days without water, 7 days without food, and be so cold, and then make it to the last day of the war and be killed. Oh, that really got me. Well, we finally got straightened out, and we went back down to the commissary. Now that commissary was full of people. Everybody must have found out about it, and boy, we didn't get a whole lot of stuff. But they had a little room off to the side, and I went back in that room, and there was a bale, just like he would bale straw, only it was a bale of T-shirts. And it had a red sheaf of wheat on it. Well, that was cleaner than what I had, so I pulled a T-shirt out of there. And then I got to looking around, and I found 3 German hats. One hat was really, it was a white hat. I believe it was goat skin. It had the hair all turned in on the inside, and it had the flaps on like Lindbergh wore, but only it had a snout on it. It was a nice hat. And Martha said she thought it belonged to the ski troopers. That's what they wore. And then I had 2 other hats. I thought, by George, now I got a few souvenirs. So I thought that's good. So I goes back and seen Martha, and I told her to ask her if she knew where I might get a Luger, a German pistol. Why, she says, well, why don't you go up there to the chateau, the big chateau up on the hill. She said, why don't you go up there? She said, that fellow is a sportsman. All right, so I asked Jim and Ed if they wanted to go along. No. Jim, he was teaching English to that 10-year-old boy. He really became attached to him. And Ed, he was just satisfied to sit on that rocking chair and roll and smoke cigarettes. Well, I didn't get the, I couldn't roll a cigarette. I'd get a hump in the thing, it would fall apart before I'd get it lit. He got pretty good at it. So I went up to this chateau. First room I got into, this room here is just about the size. I was going to say about Antrim House's main dining room, that was about the size of it. All around that room was mounted animal heads. There was animals mounted there that I didn't even know existed. And there was gun cabinets up against the wall. They were all empty. There was a desk in the center of the room. And I goes over to the desk. The 3 drawers was already out on the right side, but there was a long, thin drawer right in the center. And I pulled that out, and out came a pair of animal teeth mounted in silver oak leaves. So I put that in my pocket, and I had another souvenir. So I goes out, and I thought, well, I'll go see what's back of this baby, see what's back there. I goes back, and there was a big pond. There was a pond, and there was these Australian prisoners of war. They were down there doing something. I didn't know what they were doing, but boy, there's a lot of them. So I goes down, and here they had a line, and a pole, and a piece of wire, and they was trying to lasso frogs. They haven't had any meat either, and they wanted meat. Well, I watched them. A frog was not designed to be lassoed. just no way can you lasso a frog. And I thought when I was in high school, they got Field and Stream magazine, and they had Archibald Rutledge was his name. He was from the South. He was a quail hunter, and I really liked his articles. And he said, to catch frogs, they're attracted by red. And you put a piece of red cloth on a hook and hold it above that frog, they'll jump for it. You can catch it. Well, here I had red on my T-shirt. And I asked anyone if they had a knife. Yeah, 2 guys had knives. Well, I said, boy, I'd like to try it. Well, you go ahead. Mate, that's what it was, mate. Yes, matey. Well, I cut that red off, and I changed your wire from a lasso to a hook. You wouldn't believe how those frogs jumped for that cloth. But I couldn't time it right. I might catch 1 out of 6, but I didn't hook them. But I had them hooked enough that I could swing them out on the bank and then they would catch it. And I had 6 frogs. Those guys, they started to skin them. Well, I thought, by golly, they're going to have some meat now. So I handed this pole to one of their men. And did he ever show me up? That guy, he must have been part frog. I'd say every other one. He caught a frog. Every other one. I might have 6 out of them. I couldn't do it. Anyway, we had frogs. Well, they gave me my 6 frogs that I caught. Had them skinned. My golly, they were going to have frogs. Well, I went down and rapped on Martha's door. She seen me there carrying these frogs. Maricana swine. Oh, she didn't want anything to do with them frogs. Well, we're going to have frogs. She had lard. She had plenty of lard in the old back skillet. And boy, old Jim, he was ready. He beat up a couple of eggs, dried the frogs off, and throwed him in there. I got some of my flour. As soon as he threw that frog in there, I knew there was something wrong. I put my hand in, and then it felt a little gritty. And I made the remark about the Germans can do a lot of things, but they don't know much about making flour. Well, Martha, she came over. She went this way. And she tasted it. And she laughed. I didn't have flour. I had wallpaper started. Well, my George, we weren't going to be late. She gave us a bag, and Jim and I, we went back down to the commissary. And we went that way. And it wasn't any flour in the thing, except right in the corners. We took a finger and all 4 corners, and we got enough flour, we figured, to fry the frog legs. Well, we went up and we fried them. Well, there it was again. We couldn't eat much. We could eat off, but we couldn't eat much. So Jim, he got her son, Walter, he got Walter to try. Well, oh, he liked them. Man, he really liked the frog leg. He said, Mama, he wanted his mama to try one. Well, he finally coaxed her. She tried one. I tell you, she ate them frogs. She polished them off and wanted to know why someone in that town didn't have, as hungry as they were, why somebody didn't know how to catch frogs, or that they were even that good. So that took care of the frogs. One day, I asked her about this Luger again. Well, she said, if they didn't have any up there, I'll try to find out. So she'd leave. Now, this would have been the 13th of May. Yeah, 13th of May. She came back that night before we went to bed, and she says, I think I know where you can get a Luger. I said, good. She told me which road I should take, and they found this cave. They had to make a cut in the road. And when they made the cut in the road, that's when they found the cave. And she says, you go to that cut, you'll see a pair of wooden cellar doors leaning up against the bank. She says, that's where the cave's at. She said, I haven't been there for years. She said, we used to put our turnips and potatoes and pumpkins, and it really kept so good in that cave, no one had anything to put in the cave anymore. Well, I told her I was going to leave early the next morning, and I'd see if I could find that cave. Well, I walked right into that cut, and boy, there was the cellar doors, and like the dumbest thing I ever done in my life. I went in that cave, and I thought my eyes would adjust to it, and no adjusting to it. It was dark. It was dark in that cave. You couldn't see anything. Well, if I was going to do anything, I had to get down on my hands and knees and crawl. I started to crawl, and I was feeling around, crawling, and I went quite a ways. And good golly, Ned, I put my hand out like that, and I put my hand on a man's leg, and he drawed his leg up. You talk about being scared. Man, I'm telling you, that was something. Well, I immediately, boy, I didn't want any more of that, so I started to turn to my right to get the devil back out of there. And when I turned to the right, there was the weapons laying all on the floor of the cave. And I knew I had a Luger in my left hand, and I had another pistol in my right hand, but I couldn't tell what it was because it was in a holster. So I took that, and I was afraid to make too much noise, and I just, oh man, I took it so easy. I could see light, it got light out, and I guess there was a knot hole in that door that left enough of light came in, and I went for that light. And when I got up there, sure as the world, it was a cellar door. Down that road I went. I tell you, I went down there and I rapped on Martha's door. She just looked at me. She said, "You don't look like yourself." Well, I said, "Martha, I don't mind, maybe so, but that's me. But I tell you, I had an experience." I said, "There's men in that cave, people in that cave." She said, "What?" I said, "Yes, sir. There's people in that cave." Well, now this was the 14th. Now, I was going to leave the next morning, but going down to the railroad station. So, the 14th, we got up, and we took off to get down to the railroad station, Gallo and Ed Bulge and me. Now, the other three fellows that stayed over on the farm, I liked all of them. But this Bill Peters, I really didn't care a whole lot for him because he never done anything. He would never go for food. He never took a chance. He was born in Boston, and he never seen it dark till we went on bivouac. And he was scared of the dark, and he was scared ever since. He never done anything. My golly, Ned, we was walking down to the railroad station, and here came two people leading two horses. And my gosh, the one was Bill Peters. He stole a horse. The farmer, the Russians took the horses from the stable, and by golly, Ned, I was so proud of him. He stole a horse, and whenever they left the farmer, the old farmer had two horses. So we goes down. We weren't there too long. Here comes the freight train. Well, we got on, I think they call them gondolas, or half a car, like come up to about here on you. You can go up and set on and see on both sides of the track. And a lot of men got in the same car because they had the same idea. They blowed the whistle too much, and we'd lose our steam, and then we'd get down, we could hardly move. Then finally they'd let her build up again, and they'd blow the whistle, and then slow us down again. And I sat there, and I overheard two guys talking, and one fellow said, "Did you hear all that shooting last night?" "Yes," he said, "I did." He said, "Somebody surely must have found a lot of ammunition." "No." He said, "No." He said, "The Russians found quite a few SS people in a cave and took them out and shot them." Yeah. So, we rode that train quite a while. And by golly, then, here at a crossing was a first sergeant in a Jeep waiting for the train to go by. Well, they just stopped the train. A couple of men went over and seen the first sergeant. Told him he was prisoners of war trying to get back to the Americans. He said he would leave, he would have the trucks there. He said, "You get to the next town is Pilsen, Czechoslovakia." He said, "When you get to Pilsen, you look for army trucks, and then you get on the trucks." All right. So he wheeled around and he took off. Well, we made it to the station in sure as world. Here comes the Red Ball Express. Collared drivers in them old trucks. They had D-bars and C rations and cigarettes and chewing gum, you name it, they had her. And some of the boys, they've got ripping into it. And some of them got pretty sick too. And anyway, we got on the trucks. Now in Pilsen, most airports are way out of the city. Way out. But we went around a couple of big buildings, and going in, there was the airport. There was the tallest flagpole that I ever seen in my life. An American flag flying straight out. It was the second time I saw tears. That was the most beautiful sight you ever saw. I guess for the first time, we realized we was going to make it home. Nobody cried, but the tears just rolled down your cheeks. Well, they took us to a corner of the airport. Here came two soldiers in a Jeep. Everybody had to drop their pants and underwear, and they stuck the head of that duster in their groin area and gave it one turn. and you was as white as you could ever be. You was just covered, trying to kill the lice. Well, and they did. They killed the lice. As soon as we was done being dusted, here come a C-47 in. He taxied over and he stopped. They counted off so many men, took them over and put them on the C-47. He took off, another C-47 came down. Same thing, came over and counted off so many men. Jim and I think, got on the fourth or fifth plane. When we walked over to the plane, the flight officer came down and he said, we're trying to get as many of you back as we can, and weight is the big thing. He said, I'll allow each of you 10 pounds. All over 10 pounds you'll have to throw down on the ground because we can't take it. And dumb me, and there was Jim, he didn't have one souvenir. Didn't have one. I had these 2 pistols, I had these hats, and I had a few other things that I cabbaged along the way. And Jim got on the plane. I could have handed him my hats or the pistols, and he could have got them on the plane. My turn came to go on the plane. I'm sorry, but you got too much weight. You'll have to throw a pistol down on the ground. Well, sir, I looked at that Luger. It had a little rust on it that doggone it was still a good pistol. Anyway, I threw the pistol down on the ground, got up in the plane. We all got in the plane. I looked out the window, and there was a whole crew down, gathered everything up on the ground we had to throw out. That's how the Air Force got their souvenirs. So, we landed in France, and I think we went by bus to Camp Lucky Strike. It was a tent city. The first thing, the commanding officer, I forget his name, but he welcomed us back. Then, the next thing I guess we got was new clothes, and we got a shower, and we got a haircut, and they gave us a toilet kit, and I wanted to keep my wooden shoes. I was the only prisoner that I know of that had wooden shoes, and I wanted to keep my wooden shoes. And at first, and the sergeant, he said, I got orders to burn everything. And he said, if someone sees you with those wooden shoes, they'll know I didn't do my job, and you can't have your shoes. Man, I'd still like to have had those shoes, but I didn't get them. The doctors, they came around and talked to us. They came around and they feel around your belly and so forth, and they decided our stomachs should shrunk. We have to stretch our stomachs. So they had this tent, and it was full of blister bags. They had coca, coffee, milk, eggnog, oatmeal, cream of wheat. They gave you a pint cup, and you couldn't leave that tent till that cup was empty. Then you had to be back in less than 2 hours and get another cup. That's how you stretch your stomach. And when you're feeling good, man, they just load you up, you feel miserable. Well, anyway, I took the eggnog. And you know, every time I go to the doctor now, they'll tell me I got to stretch way too much. I wish that doctor, I could see that doctor making me do that. They gave us, and now everybody's rank was increased 1 grade, and we got our back pay, we got money, and they told us our chances of getting home was better if we would go to England, that there was more boats and so forth left England for the United States than there was France, and they'd have no trouble getting us to England. Well, Jim and I, we decided we'd go to England. So we got off of the boat right outside of London. The Americans had a hotel right outside of London. The only thing we had to do, we had to report every day, I think between 6 and 7 o'clock, at a house, they called it the Port of Debarkation. We had to go there every morning, early. Well, we went down every morning. There's an old man sitting in there in the bay windows. He'd see us coming. He'd raise the window. Not today, boys. Okay, then we had the day. We could do anything we wanted to do. We went boating on the Thames. We went, you name it. we went to Piccadilly, Trafalgar Square, we went to plays. We really done London up pretty good. And one morning, it was raining cats and dogs. We got up ready to go, and well, we'd get wet as thunder if we went out, and that they didn't give us a raincoat. Well, let's just don't go today. That's right, we won't. Next morning we go. Where were you boys at yesterday? The Queen Mary left yesterday afternoon. You'd have been home in 5 days. That's the way our luck run. Now, we was back to the Americans a little over 3 weeks. We needed a haircut. So going back from the port of debarkation, we seen an old barber opening up his shop. So we goes in, he said he'd be with us in a minute. So he got everything ready, and I got on the chair, and I got a haircut. When I got off of the chair, I thought that was a scale there. So I thought, well, by George, I'll weigh myself. Well, it took, I'm trying to think, a farthing. Took a farthing. I put the farthing in that scale, and I looked for a dowel or something to go around. Here, a little piece of paper flew out like you'd get on them Chinese food, you know. A little piece of paper about like that. It came out. I looked at that thing, and Jim says, "Bill, what do you weigh?" I says, "Jim, I have no idea. This thing says I weigh so many stone." Oh, the barber says, "Give it to me. I'll tell you what you weigh." He took it back on the counter, got his pencil, figured up. I weighed 123 pounds. I weighed 185 about whenever I was captured, and I weighed 123. And Jim was he was a lot lighter than what I was. Yeah, I was concerned about Jim. And Jim never got the weigh. I didn't have any more coins. The barber didn't have any, so Jim never did get weighed. So we went down to the port of debarkation about a week later. Here by Gully Mid, it was time for us to get on a boat. And we got on the USS Andrew Moore. It took us 23 days. We got to see the captain welcome us aboard. He said he had 500 on board. The last 250 prisoners of war to leave York, and the first 250 high point men. Well, I never in all my life ate like we ate on that boat. We had tin trays, and they would just, especially the prisoners, I don't know why, but boy, they just piled the food on, and it was good. And you had to stand at a table to eat. You had to hold your tray and eat with one hand because the sea was rough. The first week, we slept on deck because it was really nice and calm. But boy, after that, it was rough. So we sat there, standing there eating. One night, got a brick of ice cream for dessert. Boy, hadn't had ice cream. And here, by golly, it was starting to melt. So I set my ice cream off of my tray and I set it right there. And would you believe that darn boat rocked and my ice cream was shooting down the table, and then the rock back, I never got my ice cream. Now we were issued Eisenhower jackets when we got back. I got Eisenhower. Well, those high point men, they still had their old long blouses. I hung my Eisenhower blouse by my hammock. That baby, because it got so wrinkled in your duffel bag, that thing hung there 22 days. And when I went to get it the 23rd day, don't you know, one of them birds stole my jacket. So I didn't have that. So I still have the old blouse. And we got home, well, we landed in Boston, and then I got orders, 60-day furlough at home, and then I was supposed to report back to
Lake Placid.
New York, where they
Lake
had
Placid. Lake Placid.
that Lake Placid is where I was supposed to report to. And that was pretty much the story there, but there's a few things I would like to tell you. That I worked in Virginia, And the 106th Division, they have a convention every year, and they also have a magazine, and I like their little magazine. But I forgot to pay my dues. So I missed the magazine, and I went back and got an old copy, and they had an application there to fill out, so I filled the thing out. It sent my money in, and I put down on the thing what for prison camps I was in, 4B and 4F. Now, when you was in 4F, that meant that you was out working someplace. That was work detail 4F. And I guess it was about 2 weeks after that, I got a call from California from a fellow named Manuel Van Eck. And he told me that he was trying to find people that was missing in action. And he wanted to know if I knew a Hong Kong or a Charles Hill. Oh, I said, yes. I said, they was killed the 7th of May. We was strafed with the rations. I said, most all the prisoners of war that I know was either killed by the British or killed by the rations, except, well, I can tell you that story later. But, well, he was going overseas, and he wanted to know, in October he was going over, and he wanted to know if I could tell him about where they were killed. And I said, yeah. I said, on the road from Brand Urbisdorf to, what's the first town? Well, on the road to Pilsen, it'd be the same place, and about this high bank being along the road, and that's where they were strafed. And I also gave him the phone number of Ed Slayman, that he could call him. And I said, if you find him, would you let me know if you do any good? He said he surely would. So by golly, it was in October, I got a postcard from him, and they found one body, and they think it's Charles Hill. But they had to run more tests, but they was pretty. But Hom Tong was such a little fella. If they'd have found his bones, they'd have thought it was a child. Yeah, they wouldn't have thought that. Now, Jim Bard, he was from Eggertsville, New York, when I learned to know Jim. And Jim lived in Wayne, Pennsylvania, and one Sunday evening, it was right whenever Alex Helly's Roots was on television. Sunday evening, a doorbell rang, and I go to the door. Here it was Jim and Mary Bard. Jim says, Bill, I can't stay, but I was in the area, and he said, at least I had to stop and say hello. But he said, I got to be at work in the morning. We're not going to sit down. And he said, I was trying to find, I don't know if it was his grandparents or his great-grandparents' grave. And I says, Jim, did you have any luck? He said, I found them both. He said, my one grandfather is buried in Frederick, Maryland, and the other is buried in Laymaster, Pennsylvania. And I remember Mr. Conrad having an article one time in the Echo Pilot about this Bard that was captured by the Indians. And they were out around Somerset, and he escaped from the Indians. And he made it back. And I just bet $1 to some of Jim's relatives, and he told me that he had inherited Citizens Bank stock from the family. He inherited that. And then Anna Lee and I went out to see my daughter after I retired. She was stationed at Fitzsimmons Army Hospital. And coming back, was coming through Ohio, and I thought, by golly, Arthur Taylor, he's dead. But he lived in Ohio, but we got a Christmas card every year from his widow. So maybe we would stop and see her. Well, we did. We found the place. She came to the door. Somebody must have told her not to do too much to strangers or stay away from them. And we had an awful time talking to her and telling her who we were. Finally, she got, okay, I was a prisoner with Arthur. Yep, that was right. Oh, my, come in, come in. Well, we goes back, took us back in the living room, and we walked in. I seen all these German nutcrackers on a table. Now, Arthur was always a good friend of Rudolph Hoffner, our guard. They were about the same age, and they really got along good. And I mentioned about all of these nutcrackers. Yes, sir. She said the Russians, they put Rudolph in prison for 2 years. And after he got out of prison, he still carried Arthur's address. And he wrote Arthur. And at Christmas time, and Arthur wrote him. At Christmas time, he would send Arthur a nutcracker. And he had diabetes so bad, and he loved grapefruit. And Arthur would send him a case of grapefruit. And they've done that. And then one Christmas, there was no nutcracker, so she assumed that he died. Now, Tom Fox sits in front of me in church. One Sunday, Tom came back and he says, Bill, he says, Liz and I went to the shore this week. He said, you know, I got to talking to a fella, and he asked me where I was from. He said, I told him I was from Greencastle. He said, oh, I know where that's at. He said, I've been there. He said, I have a friend that lives there. Well, Tom says, well, what's his name? Maybe I know him. He says, Bill Diehl. We were prisoners of war together. Well, Tom and Liz became good friends of Mary and Jim Bard. Every time they would go to the shore, he would always bring me back some news. And one time, Jim had a bachelor son. He was getting married. Another time he came back, they heard from Walter. Tell Bill we heard from Walter. Well, Walter, I don't remember any Walter. Except that little 10-year-old boy, but I didn't think that would be it. I called Jim. He said, my grandson went to visit Germany. And he said, of course, I told him my story. And he said every night, whatever town he was in, he would look in the phone book for a Walter Syke. He was in Darmstadt, and he looked in the phone book, and there was 3 Walter Sykes. First 2 was too young, but the third one he called lived in Kulm, Czechoslovakia. He was there during the war, he and his mother and his sister, and he remembered 3 soldiers staying at their place. He remembered that, and he asked, Jim's son asked him if he wouldn't write his dad a letter and explain things to him. Yes, he would, and he did write Jim. It seems the Russians moved them all out of Kulm, Czechoslovakia into the Isle of Rügen in the Caspian Sea. They had no food, they had no place to work, they had no shoes. For 10 years they was starving. In fact, Martha died in 1949. She didn't live long. She got sick. They weren't allowed to see a doctor. And just no food, and American cigarette. They could buy 10 small fish with 1 American cigarette. No one had, the one child worked on a farm. She got like, I think it was $10 a month, about what it amounted to. They was just starving. One night, the father, it was foggy, and the father stole a boat. And he got his family on the boat, and they took off in the fog. And don't you know, he was lucky enough to get over to West Germany on the other side of the wall. And then he got a job with Mercedes, and also Walter, he got a job with Mercedes as a truck mechanic. And when he wrote the letter, he had just retired from Mercedes, and he was getting a new Mercedes in October, and he invited Jim to come over, and Jim wrote me. In fact, he sent me the letter that he received from Walter, and Jim was thinking about maybe going over. And the person that transcribed Jim's letter, she was going over. So Jim gave her the phone number of Walter. When she got to Germany, she tried to call Walter. But Walter's wife answered the phone, and she wouldn't let him talk to Walter. They think that he had Alzheimer's. So that was the end of the trip. We didn't go over. Now then, another. But they had it awful rough for 10 years. I I got a couple of letters that I gave tonight I gave some, and when I got back, I sent packages. And I sent tobacco, cigarettes is what I sent, because cigarettes was better than money. And I sent coffee, chocolate, and some other things. And I'd get a letter from them. I couldn't read the letter. I didn't know anybody. Someone told me G. Fred Ziegler could transcribe it. But he called me 3 times and wanted me to tell him my story. And I didn't do that. And I didn't want to see him. Because I don't know why. I didn't want to tell him the story at that time. I just didn't want to do it. Because there's other Paul,
Secret.
yeah, Paul Seacrest and Glenn Stotler, they were both prisoners of war. I never seen them have anything in the paper, but I'm always was sorry afterwards that I didn't, because he sent me the Echo Palette, and you don't know how long I look forward to that. I read all them little poems, all that stuff in there. I read her all. Yes, sir, I thought that was really something. And I was always sorry I didn't do that. Now, there's a couple of stories. You know, in Malmedy, the Germans lined up 80 prisoners of war and just shot them. And then we had a fellow in our outfit named Sammy Palea. He was the biggest guy in our company. Now, when they bombed Dresden day and night. They claimed they killed 100,000 people when they bombed Dresden. So about, I guess it was 10 or 13 days after the fire that it was cool enough that you could go in and look for bodies. And they came and they got some of the men that I worked with. Of course, I ran a machine, so I didn't have to go. But some of the men, they went. And they were told not to loot, not to steal. If they did, they would be shot. Well, you know you're hungry. You don't have anything to eat. Sammy Palea was down in this cellar. And how it ever survived the fire, I don't know, but he found a jar of marmalade. And he just took the lid off the marmalade and just touched it with his tongue to taste it. And a German officer seen him. They had to go up, had to dig a grave, and they asked Sam if he had anything to say. He wanted to know if he couldn't take his clothes off and give them to the rest of the men so they would be warmer than what they were. They shot Sammy. That felt good. Bad. But it was an experience, I tell you, that I wouldn't want to go through it again. But does anybody have any questions?
When the Germans rounded you up on May 8th and said that you were leaving.
How's that?
When the Germans rounded you up from the camp on May 8th and said that you were leaving and you thought you were going to another place to work, how did you find out that the war actually ended? When did you find out?
Whenever we went into Kulm, Czechoslovakia, and seen the Russians coming.
Oh, so when you saw the Russians.
That's when we knew the war was over.
Did you ever hear what happened to the rest of your company when you left them?
Not all of them. We had quite a few fatalities, but we did. But we had more people. Well, whenever I was captured, there was 7,000 captured. And that's an awful lot of men. And you can't really blame the Germans, because who has dinner ready for 7,000 people that you didn't know you was going to have? But it's a lot of people, frozen feet, frozen hands, you know. It's just so cold that I felt, you know, you feel sorry for some of the people. Whenever we was watching those evacuees trying to get to the Americans, there was an old man and an old woman down there next to the woods. And I watched him. He was trying to get her back on the road, and he couldn't get her back on the road. I think they went down to the woods to go to the bathroom. And I goes down, and I grabs the lady by one arm, and he and I together, we got her back up on the road. And we got up on the road, He had the nicest cane. It had a silver handle on it here. It was a beautiful cane. And you know, that poor soul offered me his cane. He insisted that I would take it. Well, I wouldn't take his cane. But he cried. When I wouldn't take his cane, he cried that someone would help him that way. But the Germans, well, I got some letters that you'll see that, and Walter said, he said the Germans showed everybody how. But they really paid for it the last 10 years of the Russians. They really had it bad. It was really bad. Yeah.
Where did you land in France when you went in?
Le Havre.
Okay.
Yep. I landed in Le Havre. Rained the whole time. Rained the whole time I was in France. Yep. Any other questions? Well, that's.
Bill, how old were you at that time when all this was going on?
Well,
20 or 21?
No, I was most of the guys was 19, but I was 20. Just turned 20. Yeah. That was my goal, to live to be 21. Yeah. When I was in that darn cave, I didn't know if I was going to make it. I haven't done anything that foolish in the rest of my life. That's the dumbest thing I ever done, but you know. Well, Betty went to the same church, my sister Betty went to the Lutheran church, this church here, and I had to send a package, and I got a letter, and of course, Mrs. Wine was her Sunday school teacher, and she told Mrs. Wine about getting this letter from this German family. Well, they decided maybe they would send a package. If they had clothes and so forth, and they would send a package. Well, they did. They sent a package. We got a letter back. Oh, my. They just couldn't believe it. Couldn't believe it. Well, anybody would be that kind to them. So they sent another package. And they never heard anything. Well, I says, don't send any more because your Russians run around over there wearing your clothes. That's what's going on. But I finally, my Uncle George, he would come down every Wednesday to bank meeting. And he knew the professor at Mercenburg Academy that taught German. And I would give him my letters. And then when it suited that gentleman, he would transcribe them. And then when it suited Uncle George, he'd bring them back to him. You know, it was a big deal that time. It might take 2-3 weeks to find out what the letter said. But we finally got it together. But I was one of really, I'll tell you, I was one of the lucky ones. I'm 80 years old. Never thought I would get to be that old. But I tell you, there was an awful lot of good boys, and it does burn me up now, the way I see some of the things that's going on today. You know, you kill people in war. That's what war's all about. That's what it is. You don't have to question everybody. There's mistakes made, a lot of mistakes made in war. And not everything is right, but that's the way it is. Any more questions?